All right, let's talk about styling fonts. So I'm going to start by adding a heading, an H1 element. And right below that, I'm going to add a paragraph with some dummy words. Pretty basic. Now let's see how we can style our paragraph element. So back to our style sheet, let's define a rule. The first property we're going to talk about here is font family. With this, we can change the font of this element. Now, generally speaking, we have three main categories of fonts. We have serif fonts, sans serif fonts, and monospace fonts. Of course, there are more categories, but those categories are mostly used in printing and they're irrelevant for the web. So what is the difference between these categories? Well, serif fonts have a small line or a small stroke at the end of characters. That's why they're more professional and more serious. They're often used in books, newspapers, magazines, and so on. Georgia and Times New Roman are a couple of popular fonts in this category. Of course, there are hundreds or thousands of serif fonts out there, but these are the fonts that you hear about all the time. Now, sans serif fonts don't have those lines at the edge of characters. They're more playful and modern. Here are a few popular fonts in this category. You have Avenir, Arial, Futura, Helvetica, Roboto, and of course, many, many more. Now, what about monospace? Well, what does mono mean? It means one. So monospace means one space. These fonts are a little bit different from the fonts in other categories in the sense that the width of all characters is exactly the same. And that's why these fonts are ideal for displaying code. Because when we display code, we want our characters to perfectly align. So back to the font family property. If we press Control and space here, VS Code automatically suggests a bunch of fonts. These are called web-safe fonts because they're available on most computers out there. So it's fairly safe to use them. So let's type Arial. Now, what we have here is called a font stack. A font stack consists of multiple fonts. The first font here is Arial. So when the browser sees this, it checks to see if this font is installed on the user's computer. If it is available, it's going to apply it to the paragraph element. Otherwise, it's going to look at the next font in the stack, in this case, Helvetica. Once again, if this font is available, it's going to be applied. Otherwise, the browser is going to look at the next font in the list or in the stack. Now, the last font that we type here is a generic font, which can be either sans serif, serif, or monospace. The actual font that will be used will vary from one computer to another. So we just type a generic name and let the browser decide what font should be used, okay? So let's save the changes and see what we get. Look, here's an example of a sans serif font. So our characters don't have those extra lines or edges, okay? Now, let me show you a problem with this approach. Back to our markup, I'm going to add a hyperlink below our paragraph. So take a look. What is the font applied to our hyperlink? It's a serif font. It's not the font that we applied to the paragraph element, right? But this looks ugly. We want our hyperlinks and paragraphs to have the same font. Now, one way to solve this problem is to duplicate this element and then change the rule to A for anchor. So look, that solves the problem. But we don't want duplication in our code. We don't want to apply the same font on so many different elements. So this is where we can use inheritance in CSS. We can take this font family property and apply it to the body element and let other elements automatically inherit this property. Now we can completely get rid of this rule. So take a look. Now all elements are using the exact same font. So the heading, the paragraph, and the link are using the same font. But what if you want to change the font for our heading? Well, we can define a new rule for our heading and set the font family to, let's say, Georgia, Times New Roman, Times, and serif, which is the generic name. Now, Times New Roman is placed in quotation marks because the font name contains a space, okay? So, save the changes. Here's the result. Now, our heading is using a serif font. Now, let's define a rule for our paragraph element and look at a few more properties. The next property we're going to talk about is font weight. With this, we can set the weight or the boldness of the font. We have a bunch of numbers from 100 to 900. 100 means really thin. So take a look. This is 100, but if we change this to 900, our paragraph becomes really thick. We also have a bunch of keywords here. So if we press Control and space, You can see these keywords. So we have bold, bolder, lighter, and normal. If we set this to bold, this will translate to 700. Let me show you. So let's inspect our paragraph element. Now, in the computer tab, look at the font weight property. It's 700. If we set it to normal, this will translate to 400. Here you go. So some people prefer keywords, other people prefer numeric values. Now, the next property we're going to talk about is font style. The default value is normal, but we can set it to italic to get italic text. Here's the result. Now, our paragraph is italic. We can also change the size of the font using font size property. Here we have keywords like large, larger, medium, and so on. But most people prefer to use numeric values, which can be absolute or relative values. So here we can use an absolute value like 30 pixels. Our paragraph is now a lot bigger. We can also use relative values like 1 rem. We'll talk about this in more detail later in this section. So let's just leave it at 1 rem. Now, the last property we're going to talk about is color. By default, this is set to pure black, which is also equivalent to 000 in hexadecimal form. Well, earlier I told you that hexadecimal color codes have 6 characters. So why am I typing 3 characters here? Well, if the first 3 characters are exactly the same as the second 3 characters, we can just shorten the color code. So 000 is equivalent to 6 zeros, okay? Now, generally speaking, it's best not to use pure black as your body text color. It's best to use a really dark gray. For example, we can use 111 or 222. That's really dark. That's pretty easy to dice. We can also use something lighter like 444. I think that's a little bit too light for the main body text. So let's set it back to 333. I think that's better. So now we have clear separation between headings and the main body text. Our heading is big, black, and bold, and this separates it from the main body text. So this is how we can style fonts. Now, the fonts we have listed here are called web-safe fonts because these fonts are available on pretty much most computers out there. But these days, we can easily embed custom fonts in our web pages. I'll show you how to do that next.